I never thought I'd end up in the middle of nowhere, living in a cabin that smelled like pine sap and old coffee. But that's exactly where I found myself last spring. The city had chewed me up and spit me out, leaving me with a failed relationship, a job I'd walked away from in the middle of a panic attack, and a bank account that was hemorrhaging faster than I could patch it. My cousin Derek threw me a lifeline without even knowing how badly I needed it. He managed a logging operation up in the Cascades and needed someone to handle the books, inventory, and general administrative chaos that came with running a crew of 30 men who were better with chainsaws than spreadsheets. The pay wasn't much, but it came with a cabin, solitude, and the kind of distance from my old life that felt like exactly what I needed. The drive up took 6 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until civilization felt like something I'd imagined. The last hour was on a gravel road that made my sedan suspension scream in protest. When I finally pulled up to the main camp, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The logging camp was more rustic than I'd expected. A cluster of buildings including the main office, a mess hall, equipment sheds, and a scattering of cabins where the crew stayed during the week. My cabin was set apart from the others, up a small hill with a view of the forest that seemed to stretch forever. Derek met me with a bear hug and a grin that said he was genuinely happy to see me, even if he didn't quite understand why I'd accepted his offer so quickly. That first week was an adjustment. I'd worked in climate-controlled offices my entire adult life, where the biggest physical challenge was deciding whether to take the stairs or the elevator. Here, everything was physical. The cold bit through my jackets in the mornings. The work was constant, keeping track of equipment, logging hours, processing payroll, coordinating with the mill. But it was the silence that got to me most. At night, in my cabin, there was nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just silence so complete it felt like a presence. The crew was exactly what you'd expect. Rough men with rough hands, most of them lifers who'd been working timber since they were teenagers. They were polite enough to me, the city boy who stayed in the office while they did the real work. But there was a distance. I was management adjacent, Derek's cousin, not one of them. I didn't mind. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to disappear for a while, to figure out who I was when I wasn't performing for anyone. Then I met James on a Tuesday morning in early April. I was doing an equipment check, walking through the yard with my clipboard like I knew what I was looking at, when I heard the sound of an axe biting into wood with a rhythm that was almost musical. I followed the sound around the back of one of the storage sheds and found him there, splitting rounds of cedar like they were butter. He was tall, probably 6'2" or 6'3", with shoulders that suggested years of exactly this kind of work. His hair was dark, almost black, pulled back in a short ponytail, and his beard was full but neatly trimmed. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill, and I could see the muscles in his forearms working with each swing of the axe. He didn't notice me at first, completely absorbed in his work, and I stood there longer than I should have, watching the efficient, powerful movement of his body. Then he paused, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and turned. His eyes met mine, and for a second, neither of us said anything. His eyes were green, the kind of green that looked almost unnatural in the morning light, and there was something in his gaze that made my stomach tighten. Not hostility, but an intensity that felt like being seen through. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware of how awkward I must have looked, standing there with my clipboard. I told him I was just doing an equipment inventory. He nodded slowly, then said in a voice that was deeper than I expected that the axes were in good shape, but they could use some new splitting wedges. His words were economical, no wasted syllables, but there was something warm underneath the gruffness. I wrote it down, thanked him, and walked away feeling like something had shifted, though I couldn't have explained what. Over the next few weeks, I found myself noticing James more. He worked on one of the falling crews, the guys who actually cut down the trees, which was considered the most dangerous and skilled work in the operation. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but I'd catch glimpses of him during lunch breaks, sitting alone with a book, or in the evenings, walking the perimeter of the camp like he was patrolling something. The other guys respected him, I could tell. When he spoke, which wasn't often, people listened. There was an authority to him that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with competence and presence. I started finding excuses to be where he was, checking equipment near where his crew was working, taking my coffee break when I knew he'd be in the mess hall. It was pathetic, really, this schoolboy crush I was developing on a man who probably didn't even remember my name. But there was something about him that drew me in. Maybe it was the way he moved through the world with such quiet confidence, or the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin in a way I'd never managed. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I was just lonely, and he was beautiful, and I was tired of pretending I didn't notice beautiful men. The first real conversation we had happened almost a month after I had arrived. I was working late in the office, trying to untangle a payroll issue that Derek had somehow managed to make more complicated than it needed to be, when I heard a knock on the door. It was past 9, and I couldn't imagine who'd be around. When I opened it, James was standing there, still in his work clothes, looking uncomfortable. He apologized for bothering me, then explained that there was an issue with his last paycheck. Some hours hadn't been logged correctly. I invited him in, pulled up his file, and sure enough, there was the mistake. A simple data entry error, but it had cost him about 8 hours of overtime pay. I fixed it while he sat in the chair across from my desk, and we fell into conversation. I asked him how long he'd been logging, and he told me 15 years since he was 19. He'd grown up in a small town about 100 miles north, tried college for a semester, hated it, and found his way to timber work. He asked me what brought me up here, and I found myself telling him more than I'd intended. Not everything, but enough. The burnout, the need to get away, the feeling that my life in the city had become a performance I was too tired to continue. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he just nodded, like what I'd said made perfect sense. Then he told me something that stuck with me. He said the forest was lonely before I came. At first, I thought he meant the forest in general, some poetic observation about nature, but the way he looked at me when he said it made me wonder if he meant something else entirely. After that night, things changed between us. Not dramatically, but in small ways. He'd nod when he saw me, sometimes stop to exchange a few words. Once, he brought me coffee when he saw me struggling with a particularly stubborn piece of equipment. Another time, he stayed after his shift to help me move some heavy boxes in the office. We developed an easy rhythm, a friendship that felt natural despite how different we were. But underneath it, at least for me, there was always something else. Attention, an awareness. I'd catch myself staring at his hands, imagining what they'd feel like. Or I'd lie awake at night in my cabin, thinking about the way his voice sounded when he said my name, low and careful, like it meant something. I told myself I was being ridiculous. James was straight, probably. And even if he wasn't, he was a logger, a man's man, someone who lived in a world where guys like me, soft city boys who'd never done a day of real physical labor, didn't register as options. But then there were moments that made me question everything. The way his hand would linger on my shoulder, just a second too long when he was showing me something. The way he'd look at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, with an expression I couldn't quite read. The way he always seemed to know where I was, showing up in places I happened to be, with a frequency that felt less like coincidence and more like intention. Spring turned into early summer, and the work intensified. Longer days, bigger quotas, more pressure. I was handling it better than I'd expected, finding a rhythm in the routine, but I could see the toll it was taking on the crew. James especially seemed more tired, more withdrawn. One evening in late June, I was sitting on the porch of my cabin, watching the sunset and nursing a beer, when I saw him walking up the hill toward me. My heart started beating faster before my brain even fully registered what was happening. He asked if he could join me, and I told him of course, trying to sound casual. He sat down on the steps, accepted the beer I offered him, and for a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Then, he started talking. Not about work or the weather or any of the safe topics we usually stuck to, but about real things. He told me about his ex-wife, a marriage that had ended 5 years ago because he couldn't give her what she needed. He told me about the loneliness of this life, the way it could swallow you whole if you let it. He told me about the things he'd given up to be good at what he did, and the way he sometimes wondered if it was worth it. I listened, and then I found myself talking too, telling him things I hadn't told anyone. About Marcus, my ex, and how the end of that relationship had felt like losing myself. About the depression that had crept up on me so slowly I hadn't noticed until I was drowning in it. About the fear that I'd never figure out how to be happy, that I was fundamentally broken in some way I couldn't fix. When I finished, there were tears on my face, and I felt embarrassed and exposed. But James didn't look away. He reached over and put his hand on the back of my neck, a gesture that was both comforting and electric, and he told me I wasn't broken. He said I was just lost, and being lost wasn't the same thing. Then he did something I didn't expect. He leaned in and kissed me, soft and careful, like he was asking a question. I froze for a second, my brain short-circuiting, and then I kissed him back, my hand finding the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. It was gentle at first, tentative, but then something shifted and it became urgent, hungry, like we were both starving for this. We ended up inside my cabin, shedding clothes in a trail from the door to the bedroom, learning each other's bodies with a desperation that surprised me. James was tender but intense, attentive in a way that made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. Afterward, we lay tangled together in my small bed, his chest against my back, his arm heavy across my waist, and I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Contentment. The sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We didn't talk about what it meant that night. We didn't need to. But the next morning, when he kissed me goodbye before heading to his shift, there was a promise in it. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was something real. Over the following weeks, we fell into a pattern. He'd come to my cabin after work and we'd cook dinner together, talk about our days, make love like we were trying to memorize each other. On weekends, we'd hike into the forest, finding hidden clearings and cold streams, places where it felt like we were the only two people in the world. He taught me things about the woods, how to read the trees, how to move quietly, how to find your way without a trail. I taught him things too, though I didn't realize I was doing it. How to talk about feelings without flinching, how to accept affection without armor, how to believe that being vulnerable wasn't the same as being weak. The crew noticed, of course. You can't hide something like that in a place this small. But to my surprise, no one said anything. A few guys gave us looks, some curious, some uncomfortable, but no one made it a problem. Derek pulled me aside once, asked if I was happy, and when I said yes, he just nodded and told me that was all that mattered. It wasn't the reaction I'd expected, but I was grateful for it. James told me later that he'd been terrified of this, of people knowing, of losing the respect of the crew. But it turned out that respect was built on more than who you loved. It was built on how you did your work, how you treated people, and on those metrics, James had credit to spare. As summer deepened, I realized something that both thrilled and terrified me. I was happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been in years, maybe ever. The work that had seemed like a temporary escape had become something I was good at, something I took pride in. The place that had felt like exile had become home, and the man who had seemed so unreachable had become the center of my world. James told me once, late at night with his face buried in my neck, that I'd saved him. That before I came, he'd been going through the motions, alive but not living, and that I'd reminded him what it felt like to want something, to hope for something. I told him he'd saved me too, though saved seemed like too small a word for what he'd done. He'd given me back to myself. Now, sitting here on the porch of our cabin, because somewhere along the way it became ours instead of just mine, watching him split wood in the golden light of late afternoon, I think about how strange life is, how the worst moments can lead to the best ones if you're brave enough to keep moving forward, how sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find out who you really are, how love can show up in the most unexpected places, in the middle of nowhere, in the arms of a man who said the forest was lonely before I came. I know there are challenges ahead. This life isn't easy, and neither is being two men in love in a world that doesn't always make space for us. But when James looks up and sees me watching, when his whole face softens into a smile that's just for me, I know we'll figure it out. because we found each other in the wilderness, and that kind of love doesn't come along twice. That kind of love is worth fighting for.